This is a lecture about the text written by Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas, who probably way back in his life used to be called Rafael Guillen, called "The Fourth World War Has Begun." And I'm basically just going to lay out what he says in that document. This used to be the last document that I used in the class because though it is written in 1999, which to some of you, because you're young, seems like a long time ago, to me it sounds like the present. Even though it's written in 1999, I think it does give a pretty good map of where we stand now. That's what I think's valuable about this text. It's a really good text for sort of summarizing how power relations exist in our present. And even more specifically, what is the current situation of control and revolt on a global scale? Because even from the beginning of this class, starting in 1500, we've been looking at globalization. You know, the Spanish conquest is globalization. Globalization now, of course, has a much more thorough meaning. We don't just mean that people can reach different parts of the globe. We don't just mean that European powers have access to the resources, labor, and markets of the rest of the world, which they already did by at least the late 1800s. Now we can communicate instantaneously anywhere in the world. Corporations can monitor operations instantaneously anywhere in the world. The global security apparatus, in its part, the United States military apparatus, the Russian military apparatus, the Chinese military apparatus, the Israeli one, they can see the entirety of the globe in real time from their spy satellites, which are floating around us, floating over us at any given moment. They have drones looking at us. You know, globalization and the globalization of control and the globalization of economy has an ever more concrete meaning to it. And what Marcos is giving us is a description of the overall situation in this moment of globalization, 1999. Okay, so let me start with the title, and then I'll move on to neoliberalism. The title of the text is "The Fourth World War Has Begun." Of course, we know about World War I, 1914 to 1918, World War II, depending on how you look at it, 1939 to 1945. Wait, we didn't have World War III. Well, Marcos says, you know, basically we did. World War III is the Cold War. So this is extending from 1945 until 1989 or 1990. And I think he's right. And I would hope that you would agree as well, looking at the history that we've been looking at, that the Cold War was not actually a Cold War. It was hot in many ways. So we had Korea and we had Vietnam and the Soviets in Afghanistan, and real proxy wars fought all over the globe under the heading of a Cold War between the United States and Russia. What never got hot was the nukes. All this stuff sort of happened under this, I don't know what the word is, like a witch's stare or something, you know, an icy net of tension cast by the possibility of nuclear escalation. So changes of allegiances and territorial control in the history of the Cold War were slow, and often, you know, whole escalations would just grind to a halt because the threat of full-on nuclear war would appear. Nevertheless, that was a war, and millions of people died in it. But now we're at World War IV. Well, that doesn't make any sense. The Cold War is over. The United States has become the only superpower. We're supposedly seeing the global triumph of capitalism. So-called real socialism, or, you know, Soviet-style communism, is gone. Even Chinese communism has turned itself into an interesting hybrid where China is one of maybe the largest player within global capitalism, even while remaining nominally communist in certain respects. You know, there's a whole lot of privatization really going on in China as it turns previously state-controlled production facilities into privately owned and run facilities, often taking party personnel and turning them into capitalists, etc. But supposedly we're past all this, right? Like, we could go back to Francis Fukuyama and say, history's already ended. How can we be talking about World War IV? Well, this global mopping up operation on the part of capitalism. That is what Marcos is calling World War IV. So another name for World War IV is neoliberalism. And he wants to point out this is really a war too. Now, it uses weapons that have not been seen before. The one that he talks about is the finance bomb. And what he's really talking about is the complex processes of the offering of loans by the IMF, the integration of whole nations into an international credit system, and then the utter devastation of the entirety of the infrastructure and pattern of life of that nation under the guidance of the IMF. This is stuff that really does happen. But we should also be aware of, counterinsurgency and terrorist fighting all over the face of the earth. World War IV is also a bloody war. But another name for it is neoliberalism. So let's move on from there. When the Zapatistas are asked who or what is their revolution against, they do not give the answer that somebody like Jorge Mancias seems to sort of expect. That is, they do not say that their adversary is the Mexican government. The classic Marxist-Leninist objective for a revolution was, of course, to take over state power. The Zapatistas rising up in Mexico could be expected from this old perspective to aim at taking over the Mexican security apparatus, taking over the Mexican state. That is, however, not actually their objective. I would say that they are involved in building a dual power situation, similar to what we'll see in Rojava, although Rojava's a bit more, they've got more elbow room in a way, because the strength of the Syrian state is teetering, because there is a civil war going on, and there's this geopolitical conflict involving the same global powers, Russia and the United States, and the U.S.'s NATO ally, Turkey, and the Russians' previously Soviet ally, the Assad regime. Because of this large network of interlocking powers, there's a tiny power vacuum in Rojava which they've been able to fill. Anyway, dual power, meaning they're trying to build a community-based, directly democratic, economically egalitarian, etc. Well, in Rojava they would call it a democratic confederalist situation, and in the Zapatista territory they would probably call it, an autonomous network, something like that. Anyway, they're engaged in an attempt to supplant the power of the state, not to grab it and hold it. And Marcos and the Zapatistas say specifically it is not the Mexican government that is their enemy. In fact, they claim to be supporters of the integrity of the Mexican nation state, though they know that they are at war with the Mexican army. And of course, the Mexican army is tied up with the cartels, and also with the North American, the United States intelligence apparatus and the DEA and all this kind of stuff. So the Mexican army is not just the Mexican army, it's all these other bigger forces. So when asked what they are fighting against, the answer is neoliberalism. So the first question I would like to ask and answer is, okay, what's neoliberalism? Simple answer by David Harvey that is called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. You want to think about this stuff, I totally recommend that book. It's really good. And it talks about China in particular, China and Russia's integration into neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism, on the broadest definition, is the contemporary form of global capitalism. That's what capitalism has become now. And if you really wanted to get into this, you'd probably have to see that capitalism takes different forms through time. It's continually evolving, but that's also adapting to historical and local circumstances of resistance. So what we have as capitalism now is not what we always had as capitalism. It didn't always look like this. It has certain genetic distinctive elements which always remain the same. The profit gathering. There's no capitalism without the generation of profit. There's also no capitalism without the concentration of profit into smaller and smaller groups of people. So there is a continuity. We can call it capitalism at these different points, but the late 1700s, when we see the rise of capitalism, although I would argue that its seeds are beginning 100, 200 years before that, capitalism was a system rooted in quite a wide range of merchant practices. By the 1800s, with industrialization, capitalism came to be rooted in a certain small set of industrial robber barons, at least by the end of the 1800s. The way that Lenin analyzes this, he says in the middle of the 1800s there was a sort of period of competition, and at this point some of the ideology that goes along with capitalism, which says that capitalism and competition on a free market are identical. Maybe that was sort of true in the middle of the 1800s, but by the later 1800s, which is also the period of the conclusion of colonialism, it's not true at all. Capitalism has transformed itself into an oligopoly, into a small range of monopolies over one and another sector. And this is an important thing to recognize. You know, if you are a person who is committed to capitalist ideology, you know, you just sort of believe what you've been told. You're not listening to this like one radical professor and his like, you know, televised like bullshit session. You don't want to listen to me. You want to hold on to what your family and your church and the media says. So you might think like, well, but wait, you know, capitalism does have to do with competition. But, you know, ask yourself, is that really true? Is it really true that there are multiple competitors for, say, like internet distribution of, you know, like digital documents? Of course it's not. You know, there's fewer and fewer. And so it looks like capitalism is changing historically. And first it becomes industrial monopolies. And then there's a shift, probably at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, where the center of power stops being people like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. Of course, they're dead set, so they have insane power on a local basis for a long period of time. But they're old school because their empires were based on single industries, you know, railroads or steel. By the 20th century, capitalism is turning into financial capitalism. It's banks and holding systems of banks. It's bankers who control the vast majority of the capital, and they transform that into one another industrial or other endeavor, and then it turns back into money. My point is simply that capitalism is changing its form and time, and the form that it has now taken we call neoliberalism. So I'm just going to like sort of work through this list, which I just derived from Marcos' text, about what neoliberalism involves. What does the form that capitalism has taken in our day, what does it look like? What are its distinctive features? So here are some of them. Generally speaking, neoliberalism involves the systematic preference of the economic over the social. We shut down welfare programs. We open up the Arctic to drilling. We defund schools. We go to war, all for the sake of the so-called markets. We've heard this so much that it almost doesn't sound weird, although I suppose if you pause to reflect on it, it ought to, that we don't know what the fuck the markets are. I mean, have you ever run into a market on the street? A market is, to some extent, an abstract thing. And when people tell us the market demands this or demands that, it's always somebody telling us that. It's not just us recognizing it. A market is, to some extent, an abstract thing, to some extent, a mathematical thing, although it has a concrete reference, you know, the distribution of goods or the setting up of people to be able to pay for goods. But that seems like a small section of human life. And yet we now find ourselves in a situation where whole wars are carried out because that's what the markets demand. Whole cities, Detroit in particular, are just totally wrecked. Or look at Flint, Michigan, which is right there, because of what the markets demand. Labor is outsourced away from the United States to cheaper places where they will be violently prevented from unionizing. And though this pisses off people in the middle of the country, and this comes back to one of the things that I think Trump actually picked up on, you know, the disenfranchisement and the anger of people in the middle of the country as their livelihoods and the prosperity of their situations just go to hell. Why they would then go and vote for the billionaire, as if the billionaire is going to solve anything for them, that's another question. But all that stuff happens, you know, Detroit becomes a wasteland because the markets demand it. And while people in Detroit may have been pissed off about it, no government action, no large-scale popular action, prevented that kind of thing from happening because we seem to be resigned. I guess the point here would be that as capitalism takes different forms, as different varieties of economic activity go on, it's a sort of natural coincidental process. Coincidental's too light. A correlated process, a parallel process, where an ideology is generated that says, well, whatever is happening now is what is natural and what has to happen. So we've been surrounded by this ideology so much that we're used to hearing, well, that's what the market demands. That's what's good for the economy. And we privilege the economy over what is necessary socially, what is necessary for bodies to live, what is necessary for humans to prosper. All that shit doesn't matter. And it even sounds backwards when I talk about it. It sounds idealistic, right? And when I talk about what the economy needs, it sounds like kind of, I don't know, pragmatic and concrete and hardcore. This is a reflection of the ideological structure which accompanies neoliberalism. And so we are included in this process in part by being convinced that the economy needs to drive everything. What's happening under neoliberalization? Everything is being privatized. And specifically, if you think about like the 20th century in the United States, and then think about the 20th century in, say, Africa, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. Let's start in the U.S. In the U.S., we have the Great Depression, this massive labor movement, which pushes the New Deal, which establishes a whole bunch of work programs and welfare programs and educational programs, things that hadn't existed before. Through the 1940s and 1950s, the labor movement is defanged, it's decommunized, it's de-leftized. But there's a model, and I was talking about the forms that capitalism has gone through. I sort of skipped things because I was speaking roughly. There's a model that becomes dominant from the 1950s till the 1970s, which is called Fordism, after Ford Motor Company. And what's his name? The Nazi, Mr. Ford. He literally was a Hitler supporter. But he had the novel idea, important economic idea, that, yeah, you want to extract profit from your workers, so you want to pay them as little as possible. But there's another dimension to making money, which is being able to sell your product. And if you pay your workers high enough for them to be able to buy that product, then you're going to sell more product. And in the end, you're going to end up with a greater profit than you would otherwise. So the basic idea of producing a middle class in the United States out of, for example, auto workers in Detroit, that's a capitalist model. And it becomes dominant, and it becomes dominant at the same time as a certain variety of economic theory. Keynesian theory is dominant. That goes through the 1950s, 1960s, up until the 1970s. You know, David Harvey's book, he identifies 1973 as like not a bad year for saying like, well, this is sort of where neoliberalism starts. That's the year at which general income levels while inflation goes up. So people stop getting pay raises. And I was talking about privatization. Everything gets privatized, right? So through this period, through the New Deal, World War II, the Fordist period, there had been a lot of buildup of social programs in the United States. There had been a buildup of the middle class in the United States. Now, it's important to recognize that all that wealth which was being concentrated here was being extracted from elsewhere in the rest of the world. Nevertheless, there was a tendency towards, in some cases, putting the social above the economic, or at least putting them on an equal footing. After 1973, that all falls apart. And so what neoliberalism means on the domestic front is that previously public programs are going to be defunded, gutted, and privatized. So healthcare systems, educational systems. 1973, California has a badass educational system. You can go to community college wherever you happen to live. You can be from really low economic bracket, go to community college, do reasonably well, and end up in a really good school. Do really well and end up in one of the greatest schools in the world. You can go to UC Berkeley. You know, the integration of California's community colleges, Cal States, and UCs is a pretty impressive social accomplishment. Well, that's been backed off systematically. It's been defunded and defunded and defunded and attacked in all kinds of ways over the past 40 years. And of course now, like with Betsy DeVos, like maybe we're going to see the death throes of this stuff. Since I'm talking about education, the general point is domestically, things that were public, funds that were used for public good are increasingly privatized. Public funds are increasingly pulled into corporate bank accounts. A typical feature of neoliberalism is the precarization of labor. That's a weird word. The making precarious of labor. Meaning that, say like 1959, 1961, you were a worker in Detroit. You could sort of expect to stay with Ford or GM or whichever company for your entire life. Now, of course, there were like harder situations for black people, but at least there was some degree of job security for a whole lot of people. Nowadays, the preferred model for hiring people is not to make them an employee, give them health care, give them a pension. And now, of course, like as these different towns go bankrupt, etc., pension funds they just take them away from you. You lived your whole life being a cop or being a firefighter, being a city employee, and like you're ready to retire, and now they're like, oh, sorry, we can't give you that money. It's your money, but it's not your money anymore. We have to take that stuff to pay off debts. So it goes into banks. And the preferred model of employment now is contractors and subcontractors. So that's what I am in this class. That's what 70 to 75% of all college professors are in the United States. We are part-time, we're nominally part-time labor. They make us be part-time so that they don't have to pay us benefits. Now at the Cal States, it's actually a bit better because we have a union, pretty strong union, and if I keep a certain threshold of classes, which is hard to do, especially when they axe my department because they don't need the humanities anymore. And that's something that happens in education. Neoliberalism in education means systematic dismantling of the liberal arts. People don't want you to think about history. They don't want you to just develop people. Capital doesn't want you to develop a critical intelligence to be able to evaluate your situation and understand who the power players are and decide whether they're actually acting in your interest. This kind of shit that you can learn by studying philosophy and history and literature and all that. They don't want that. So they're canning all that stuff. And then generally they're turning labor, where labor used to be, had a like decent job that you could count on. And people always pick on tenure in academia as if it was this outlandishly secure thing. That's kind of bullshit. It really just means that, a tenured professor can't get fired without just cause, which is basically what you would hope for any reasonable job position, right? Well, all this stuff is being phased out. And in academia, part of the phasing out has to do with mocking tenure as if it were a ridiculous perk that nobody deserves. Well, not only do they not deserve it, but we don't fucking have it anymore. So let's go back to the general picture. Jobs become more precarious. There's less health plans, less job security. People are increasingly working part-time jobs in a whole bunch of different places. People are floating around. Capital likes this. Neoliberalism likes this. It's a flexible workforce, which it can do with as it wants, which is really hard to unionize. It's hard to unionize adjuncts because we all work at a whole bunch of different schools. How are we going to unionize when we never even meet one another? Like, that's really useful from an employer perspective, right? Neoliberalism involves precarity in general. So I said, think about what it means domestically. Domestically, it means that public things, public lands, national parks are being privatized. So let's open up the national parks to more and more oil drilling. Let's shrink the size of the parks so that this is all the stuff that the Trump administration is doing. What's happening under Trump is also what happened probably under Obama and clearly under Bush 2, and that is that the institutions previously put in place to safeguard the public good and public resources are now being dismantled from within. So you put Scott Pruitt in charge of the EPA in order to dismantle the EPA. You put Betsy DeVos in charge of education in order to dismantle education. What do they want to happen to education? They want to turn all the public shit into private shit. Why? Well, because then that money that was previously, that tax money that was previously going into the schools can now go into private corporations like National University and all the online schools and charter schools and Christian schools in the case of Betsy DeVos. That's her big thing. This is what happens domestically. Now think about, I said, also think if you want to understand neoliberalism and the general privatization of public things, you should think about Africa, North Africa and the Middle East. Let's just look specifically at the state socialist regimes that were put in place in the course of decolonization. You can take Algeria is not a bad example. Egypt is a pretty easy one. I would say that the Syrian conflict has to do with this too. Take Egypt. In Egypt, in the 1950s, there was independence movement, which sought to extract itself from northern capitalistic neo-colonial control, especially under this charismatic figure named Nasser. And Nasser worked out a coalition of different nations, including Syria and Iraq, and I think Jordan and Egypt. There are a couple other members who formed a socialist bloc trying to advance Arab control over Arab territory. And they succeeded to a certain extent. The Ba'ath Party is a remnant of that. So the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the Ba'ath Party in Syria, stems from Arab nationalism. And it's a form that state socialization and decolonization took in that part of the world. And so what they did was they nationalized a whole bunch of resources. They took over oil reserves. They took over refineries. They took over, in the case of Nasser for a period, they took over the Suez Canal, which was to control global shipping. And they did a whole bunch of socialist things. They set up big education systems. They set up big healthcare systems. A lot of people don't know that prior to 1990, if you were sick in the Middle East and you needed to go somewhere for a specialist, somewhere that had like fancy equipment and stuff, you would go to Iraq. So Saddam Hussein's Iraq was actually a haven for medical treatment. Of course, he, much worse than somebody like Castro, really was. He was a dictator, and he persecuted the hell out of his enemies, and the Kurds especially, which is, that's who's involved in Rojava primarily. But at the same time, they did construct a socialist world where lots of the resources, the national resources, were used for the national population. Go back to Egypt, large housing systems, guarantee of housing to Egyptian citizens. These are the sorts of things that under neoliberalism are being re-privatized. Neoliberalism in a way is a reassertion of the colonial agenda. So what happens is that places like Egypt are forced through a whole bunch of different circumstances into conditions of debt. Once they're in debt, they're offered large-scale loans. And by the way, this is a favorite thing of the banking industries because, banks, they like to do big loans because they get big returns, right? But there's risk in loans. But if you loan to a nation state, it's hard for the nation state to just disappear. The nation state is not going to declare bankruptcy and shift its corporate name to another one so that you can't recover your funds. Nation states are good investments. So by means of the International Monetary Fund, backed up by the World Bank, loans are now offered to Egypt. But the loans that Egypt takes, because it has to, because it's been leveraged into doing that, and this is the same shit that happens in Algeria, those loans are accompanied by rigorous and hyper-complex, long and detailed lists of demands about how Egypt has to change its economic circumstance. And what this always consists in, they call them structural readjustment plans or structural adjustment plans. Structural adjustment means that things that were kept for the benefit of the public, housing, for example, or healthcare, are now going to be opened to capital investment. They're going to be opened to control for profit from entities outside of Egypt. This is neoliberalism on the global scale. And it's constantly finding these little sectors, these little pockets of value, of possible market, of possible profit that have not been sucked up into the richest 1% of the 1%, and they're doing that. So this means that neoliberalism, like all capitalism, is aiming at the ever greater concentration of wealth. I think now it's something like the richest 6 or 8 people in the world control as much money as the poorest half of the world's population. So you got 6 people, all men, over here. That's 5, but I don't have an extra finger. Compared to, how many billion people are there in the world now? 8? 4 billion people have as much value as, well, pretty soon it'll be 4 people. 4 to 4 billion. Compare that to what the conquistadors did the way that they valued indigenous life. If a Caribbean person was rash enough to kill a Spaniard was going to kill 100 of the indigenous, because Spanish life was worth 100 times as much as indigenous life. Well, now what do we got? We got 4 northerners, 6, 8 capitalists, who are worth as much as 4 billion people and make decisions which impact them en masse. So it's the continued concentration of wealth. What else? Destabilization of labor. And this is related to migrations. Maybe talk about migration. Big increases in refugee flows and in migrant worker flows. Why? Due to the chronic destabilization of one and another territory. There's a benefit for Germany, for example, in Syria's destabilization. Now, of course, this is a hot and difficult topic in German politics. You know, a lot of people don't like how many, the Germans absorbed more refugees than anybody else, like 1 million refugees. Maybe, whenever I give you numbers, just assume that they're fucking wrong, but that they're somewhere in the ballpark, because that's all I care. So let's say 1 million refugees. Way more than other European nations, and way more than the US, who basically has refused to take any. But they did so because there's a benefit for them economically in doing that. Of course, you could see a flow of refugees as being an economic liability. But, I mean, these are cheap workers, and they want cheap labor. But they're also unemployed people, and unemployed people drive down the value of existing labor. And it causes it such that, like, existing German unions ought to be really damn careful about striking, about making demands, because there's this huge pool of people just waiting to take their jobs. The bigger the pool of unemployed people, the less the power of organized labor in general. This is beneficial. The destabilization of labor is beneficial to capital. Now, it's not like anybody is saying that there's some nefarious one of these 6 people sitting back here being like, okay, now I want to produce a war in Syria, and that's going to produce a flood in Iraq and Libya, and that's going to produce a flood of refugees, which is going to drive down values. It's not like there's some like one evil bastard in the background deciding these things. There's a structural situation which tends to produce these effects, but there certainly is the recognition on the part of real capitalists that there's some interesting, useful effects for us in this too. Let's not back that off entirely. Oh, and I said that Syria, I think, like the conflict in Syria is related to the general advancement of neoliberalism. I think that's because, you know, the Assad regime was the inheritor of a socialist regime, and while the younger Assad had started to allow certain amount of privatization, it wasn't that much. And so there were still a whole bunch of state-run refineries, state-run oil fields, state-run energy. You know, these are the big contracts that people want, by the way. Like, India has been just devastated by allowing in multinationals to set up like new hydroelectric and power plant situations for them. They have been robbed blind. If you want to read about that one, read this wonderful writer named Arundhati Roy, Indian woman writer and activist. Read a book called Power Politics, just about that. I mean, this shit is going on all over the place. Like, the integrity of nation states is being devastated globally by the incursions of global capital. Okay, anyway, so labor instability, and then 2 more things in general that we should understand by neoliberalism, and then we'll go on to sort of the way that Marcos wraps this stuff up. There's been a communications revolution, of course. Probably it's starting in the 1950s, 1960s, but it becomes really prevalent and prominent in the 1980s. Cable TV and satellite TV, but then the internet. This communications revolution, which results in all of us having our cell phones that we're checking all the time, all of us being on these computers all the time. We're submerged in these rapid flows of information and images and so on. That opens us up to a new kind of control, which really has never been seen before. A real-time control. A real-time control, even not only over thought and understanding and the consequent decisions upon action, but even upon affect. The way that human bodies are lived can be altered, will be altered by media flows. I mean, if you don't believe that, think about like September 11th. You know, the whole nation went into shock, but it went dependably into shock because of that media distribution. It's possible for a government to cause the bodies of its population, or for a corporation to cause the bodies of its customers, its clients, its captive markets to go into one and another agitated state. Control, by means of the communication revolution, by means of the wide media apparatus, is entering dimensions that no one has ever seen before. Control is operating upon brain structure at this point through these continual flows of advertising. So this is new. And then something that's been going on since World War II, but gets accelerated when the Cold War ends, when the counterbalance to American global power is destroyed. American culture is saturating the world. Our values, our shows, our stupid jokes, our stereotypes, our racist ideas, our sports, our video games, they're saturating the globe. This is what Marcos says is neoliberalism. Now, the sort of rhetorical or, compositional procedure that Marcos goes through is he says, like, okay, you can understand neoliberalism as producing 7 puzzle pieces across the world, which all fit together almost, but not quite. And here's his list. He's like, okay, so, and we're still listing off basically typical features of neoliberalism, but more generally, because of how Marcos ends, we could also say we're describing generally how the situation of control and resistance on a global scale exists right now. And what's the structure? How is power structured globally? First of all, an ever-increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Secondly, he puts it, total exploitation of the total world. I talked about this in terms of opening up all these different markets, but you could also think about it in terms of opening up all these different brains, right? Think about, like, what's actually going on when people study advertising on websites. These little pop-up icons and stuff. Like, we're now at the level where we're trying to control attention. We're trying to draw attention on the basis of these digital media platforms for seconds at a time in order to produce mnemonic pattern recognition and future buying tendencies. That's operation upon the neural system, upon the nervous system. Power really does exist in your body now, right? So, like, total exploitation of the total world. This is the general tendency of neoliberalism. A life of wandering for increasing numbers of people because of regional conflicts. And this goes together with state violence, and specifically with counterinsurgency. So here's something worth pausing on and emphasizing. I've been saying this for a while through this course, but I want to say it again. There's no such thing as the perpetual expansion of capitalist economy without an accompanying military component. The markets do not just produce themselves or spread themselves. They are always assisted by the jackboot. They're always assisted by military, and especially increasingly by special forces. And the name for the variety of military / police activity, because ever since, say, like since Vietnam, police activities, police actions, and military activities are ever close together. Or if you want to think about a contemporary example of that, look at Ferguson. Look at the general militarization of American police forces. The technique which is employed and deployed primarily by military and police agencies is called counterinsurgency. This is what's taught under the heading of the war on drugs, which is really cover for anti-guerrilla activity in Mexico, Central America, South America, and for like radical imprisonment of large numbers of people of color in the United States. And you have all these different police people coming from Central America, South America, to the United States, to Fort Benning in the School of the Americas, to be taught techniques for counteracting drug activity, but it's the same thing as counterinsurgency. This is a military police system which is increasingly out of the control of sovereign nation states, increasingly integrated with, say, the United States, especially the United States, intelligence, data gathering, and direction, increasingly integrated police forces, intelligence forces, detention facilities, torture practices, surveillance practices, establishment of domains of terror and fear to suppress unionization, to suppress the development of opposition, to suppress organization of any kind. This is what neoliberalism does not want. It doesn't want organized populations. And it uses a security apparatus in order to achieve that. Constant surveillance, constant rounding up of precarious bodies, constant use of threats and torture. This accompanies this global attack of capital on whatever is left. So there's increasing state violence. There's also an increasing relationship between state power and criminal cartels, so that it's increasingly hard to tell them apart. Take like Russia, for example, but take Russia and Mexico as two good examples. What's the difference in Russia between the state forces directed by Vladimir Putin and the various manifestations of the Russian mafia that all the oligarchs who Putin is a part of and from whom he sort of emerges are also affiliated with? There's a total continuity between the Russian mafia and Russian intelligence and state forces. Or at least there's maybe not a total continuity. There's a decent continuity. There's a lot of overlap. And of course the same thing is true in Mexico. What's the cutoff? Where's the clear delineation between Mexican police and Mexican cartels? Well, there isn't one, because the cartels control the police. What's the difference between the Mexican legislative and executive personnel and the cartels? Well, there isn't one. Now, they're different things, but they totally overlap because the cartels have figured out how to infiltrate, how to integrate themselves into the government apparatus. But this is not just accomplished because of corruption in Mexico. This is not just because the cartels have gotten too strong and they need to be suppressed. Thank God the U.S. is here to bomb some shit. No. They became powerful because they worked together with the CIA and the DEA and Mexican army to suppress leftist guerrilla groups. You want to learn that stuff, and go watch like the endless series available on Netflix about like Pablo Escobar. I mean, that's true. The secret services, the intelligence apparatuses, the intelligence dimensions and special forces dimensions of militaries have historically been working across South and Central America with organized crime. And typically, they prefer organized crime to leftist groups. And they use their connection with organized crime in order, this is just another variety of like picking some vigilantes, right? Hey, man, the cartels have got some serious infrastructure in place. They have some trained people who know how to use violence. Why don't we just use them? So there's an increasing overlap between these. Marcos specifically talks about the overlap financially speaking. He's like, look at, tax havens. Go to like the Cayman Islands or something, where there are more bank accounts than there are people. Who is it that flies into those airports and hangs out at these like posh bars and restaurants in order to deal with their accountants and shit? Well, it's super wealthy capitalists. I mean, places like Facebook and Microsoft. They like to put their money somewhere where the U.S. can't tax it because they want to keep that money for themselves. And people from Russia, the oligarchs from Russia, but also the cartels from Russia, and also the cartels from South America. They all intermingle there. Oh, and who else? Global intelligence services, the Mossad, and MI6, and all these people actually interact there. And it's not just that would make for like a good action movie, which clearly it would. I love spy movies and shit like that. It's that like it provides a window into the real composition of power at this point in history. There's really no difference between illegitimate power and legitimate power. It's all the same power. It's all corporate/cartel power. It's all the power of capital. And capital at this point in history is merciless. And then lastly, what Marcos refers to, I'm still just detailing, what is neoliberalism? What is the enemy that the Zapatistas think they're fighting, that they think that we all need to fight? That I think we need to fight. Neoliberalism is the answer. And the second to last thing here is what he calls the mystery of megapolitics. Megapolitics meaning politics that extends beyond the scope of the nation state. And mystery because we don't get to see how it works. It has nothing to do with democracy. Its actual maneuvers are never present within the media because it owns, the actors own the media. I mean, the next time you think that you can just find your news easily by just turning on CNN or whatever, think again. The owners of CNN are integrated with all the other owners, and there are certain things those owners are not going to share with you, especially things that might lead you to organize and offer resistance. The specific feature of the mystery of megapolitics, or the key feature of megapolitics in general, is that we have now hit a point in history, which didn't used to be exactly the case, where corporate power clearly exceeds the power of any given nation. Even in the United States, the most powerful military nation in the world, maybe China's more powerful economically at this point. Even in the United States, the interests of corporations clearly go beyond the power. The power of corporations goes beyond the power of Washington, D.C. And I'd say it goes beyond the power of the Pentagon, but like really things are more complicated than that, because Donald Rumsfeld pulled a neoliberal trick on the Pentagon where he turned it into a hollow corporation. He gutted out. You know, it used to be that if you were in the Army, one of the jobs that you could get while you were overseas was to work KP, to work in the food facilities. Under Rumsfeld, all that stuff gets turned over to corporations. So even the United States military gets turned into a market for practicing pharmaceutical use and all this kind of stuff. The corporations are more powerful than the governments, and they've been taking over the governments. And so what happens in national politics, this media immersed, docile, fearful, precarious population is submerged in this narrative, this big drumbeat about, are we going to vote for Hillary or are we going to vote for Donald? But the truth is that whoever it is that gets into office, they will be nothing but a dwarf. This is the way that Marcos talks about it. They are the dwarves of capital. And I think we're supposed to picture like Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, right? Although we're all swept up in these domestic dramas, Hillary versus Donald and Macron versus, I forget the French candidates, particular populations immersed in their media bubbles get all worked up about what's going to happen. But the truth is that whether it's Hillary or Donald who comes into office, they will ultimately be doing the interests of the global corporations, of the most concentrated pockets of capital, because those pockets of capital are now in charge of the world, and their power has exceeded the power of any given nation state. Lastly, number 7, puzzle piece number 7. And remember, he says these puzzle pieces don't fit together, and that's the problem. That's a reference to Marxist theory and the whole thing about contradictions that I talked about a couple of lectures ago. Like, the shit doesn't fit together. The system is not rational. Everything is not working smoothly. We do not know that it is all going to turn out fine. Shit is fucked up, and we had probably better do something about it. So puzzle piece number 7 is the answer to all of this stuff, but it's only the beginning of an answer. Marcos doesn't have a full answer, but he has the beginning of an answer, and it sounds like he has something of a faith. Now, this is 1999. And he says, number 7, and he also describes this as a feature of neoliberalism, is that neoliberalism generates its own resistance. It generates what Marcos refers to as pockets of resistance. And I think this is important to wrap up on. The Zapatistas understand themselves as revolting not against the Mexican government, but against neoliberalism, against the contemporary form of global capitalism. And they are one among many pockets engaged in the same fight against the same enemy. So the people who get in contact with the Zapatistas and organize this massive opposition to the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999, which leads to what's called the Battle of Seattle. It's the first massive protest in the anti-globalization movement, and it's the only one to have succeeded in really shutting down procedures of the WTO. Those people composed, in a way, one more pocket, but in reality, many, many more pockets of resistance. Like, so if you look at the anti-globalization movement, you'll see that, especially look at Seattle, 1999. It was composed of labor unions, some mainstream, some more radical, anarchist groups. The IWW is, in large part reborn out of this movement. But then there's environmental activists. There's gay rights activists, there's indigenous activists. So all these different groups, and that's just a short list, all these different groups have in common that they are forced into positions of precarity. They are attacked in a whole bunch of different ways, depending on their local conditions, by neoliberalism, immigrant rights groups. And the way that Marcos thinks about it is, it sounds like he has hope for some form of global revolution, but that global revolution is no longer imagined as the Marxist one, where everybody's going to be got into line. You know, all the workers are going to come to have the same understanding. Some like badass communist leadership will have taught them the truth about capitalism and the truth about how to change the world into socialism, which is going to be good. It's not that model anymore, where there's going to be like a last battle and we're going to shoot it out with them. That is not the model. And this is not to say that Marcos is not supporting full-on guerrilla movements elsewhere. He is. He's still of the tradition of Che Guevara. But he's saying that necessarily neoliberalism produces all these different pockets of resistance, and each one of these pockets has to resist in its own way, according to its own conditions, according to the abilities and the needs of the members of its own group. And this is sort of his concluding statement. And I would just have you recognize this, again, matches, at least very generally, the anarchist model for organization, for social economic organization. You have a whole bunch of different autonomous groups which are totally free to conduct themselves as they see fit. And then these groups can't survive by themselves. Go read Peter Kropotkin. He knew this in 1880, 1890. They can't survive by themselves. They have to put themselves in relationship with one another. Thus, the Zapatistas surviving because of their connection with like AIDS activists in New York in the early 1990s. These kinds of networks, which are facilitated by the Zapatista Encuentros, that's what they're trying to do. It's similar to the sorts of gatherings that Che Guevara and Franz Fanon attended in the period of decolonization. They're trying to calibrate opposition to global capitalism.